It's time for us to check back in with the family history and stories of Opal Corn Myers. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. You can also find a link in the description below of where you can buy this wonderful book. I have it available in my Etsy shop. The book. Life didn't end for me or the community after Ben's passing, of course. Only a couple years later, when Catherine Marshall's book, Christy, was finally done and published by McGraw-Hill Company in 1967, it quickly became a national bestseller. In fact, it was one of the top 10 novels of 1968. Why, you can just imagine what a commotion it caused up here in these parts. There were people who loved the book and the attention it brought to the area. Others acted like they were insulted and resented the way Catherine described them as impoverished and shoeless, even though that was referring to the condition of this area some 50 years earlier. But most of the people were excited and proud to have a book written about our community, and for sure, absolutely everyone was trying to figure out who in their family could be this character or that character. Everybody was carrying on something fierce. There were even fights over the characters. You could hear the ramblings everywhere. Who was Fairlight? Who was Birdseye? Dr. McNeil? Why, there weren't never no doctor living up here. You would hear them saying that a certain character was their grandfather or mother, while others would say, well, that couldn't have been my mother because my mother knew how to read. Christy was not meant to be a factual book. Rather, it was intended as a fiction novel. In fact, Catherine told me that the book was only about 65% based on the life of her mother, and the rest was just fiction put in to make the story more interesting and to add conflict. Compressing several years into one gave it more action. I guess it included stories that happened up here from 1909 to 1913. She said some of the characters were real and some were made up by combining 2 or 3 real people, while other characters were just totally fiction. For example, I believe that the character Fairlight was a combination of my Grandma Corn and a young girl named Carrie Teague who lived up here in the hollow in the house above the Click House. Carrie was always traipsing around and playing with the children. She was probably creative and physically more like Fairlight too. Carrie was only 11 when she married, and she had her first child before she was a teenager. Her husband was much older. He was very proud that he had a young wife to wait on him, and he enjoyed spoiling her. He didn't make her go out and work in the fields like other married women had to do. Now you just know that no young girl wants to sit in the house by herself all day, so she would take her children out in the woods with another girl who had also married young and her little children. They would spend all day out in the woods or at the creek where they would fish and play in the water. They weren't all that much older than their children. My grandma was older, probably in her 50s. She had a lot of the personality and character qualities of Fairlight. The family unit would have been more like my grandma's. Grandma liked to sew, and possibly the shadows could have been referring to her. She used to tell the time by where the shadows were on the knotholes on the porch. She'd say, "Look at this knothole. When the sun gets to here, go tell Flory to come and put on the bread. And when the sun gets to this knothole, go look in the mailbox." She actually kept track of time by those knots on the porch. She would sit there on her porch late in the evenings as the shadows crept down from that hill over there, or she would sit by the window and sew until the light was gone. She wasn't afraid of the shadows like in the book, but it would aggravate her sometimes when in the early evening the shadows would block out the sunlight and she would have to stop sewing or whatever she was doing. She wasn't afraid of death either like Fairlight was. She was ready for it. The shadows in the book probably represented the superstitions of the back mountain people because many were afraid like that. Of course, we all knew who Ruby May was and the family who had the epileptic son. Some of the characters didn't turn out the way Catherine had first thought they would when she got started on the book. Fairlight started out as a minor character, just a face in the community, but ended up being one of the main characters. And she had planned for Birdseye Taylor to be one of the main characters, but he ended up being a minor one. She wouldn't tell me any more than that, so I was right there with everyone else wondering who people were. But I did have an advantage in my guessing because I had told Catherine about all the people here and the stories of the community. When a book has that much fiction in it, things don't have to be told exactly like they really were, and there certainly were several differences between the book Christy and how things actually were at the mission. For one thing, the mission school had already been going for several years and went through the 8th grade. Until the chapel was built, all the classes, which were only for boys, were taught in the front room of the mission house. In addition to the basic subjects, Latin and algebra classes were also available for the few brighter and more advanced students. There were also more workers than just John, David Grantland, and Lenora Christy. They had a housekeeper, Bible teacher, and a Sunday school teacher, and many times a nurse who not only served the school, but also the surrounding community. I can remember the nurse who was there during the influenza epidemic of 1918. One of the chapel women was typically in charge of everything, along with as many as 4 or 5 workers. The 2 bedrooms on the 2nd floor each had double beds where the women workers stayed. John slept in the bunkhouse across the road. Guess it was sometime in 1910 or thereabouts that John and Lenora were married. They continued working at the mission as a team for several more years until Lenora got pregnant with her first child, Catherine, and then they moved to Greenville, Tennessee, in order for Lenora to get medical attention. There just wasn't any way of getting a doctor back in here quickly when one was needed. There was not even a way to get a car back in here until several years later. It didn't matter to me that it was fiction. I was proud to have helped Catherine with the stories and pictures of this area and to be able to show her the actual records from the mission school. But when a person writes a great book like Christy about the place where you grew up, you just naturally have strong and good feelings about them. And that's why I loved Christy so much, because it was a story about the mission I had loved since I was just a girl. I read it over and over and made notes in my copy of Christy. MGM Studios. After Christy became so popular, I think it was in late 1968 or very early 1969, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios bought the movie rights. Catherine told me they were considering Katharine Hepburn for the part of Alice Henderson. If they did get her, because she was such a big name, they might just go out and find someone who was not known at all for the part of Christy. They had done that with Gone with the Wind, and it had turned out pretty good. She told me all excited that Isabel Leonard was going to write the script for the movie. I had never heard of her, but Catherine said she was the very best. She had written the script for Funny Girl, but I'd never heard tell of that either. That Isabel woman sent a crew of cameramen to take pictures and film some girl walking through the snow like Christy did to get to the mission to see what it might look like. All of that fell through. There was never a movie with Katharine Hepburn. Another time, MGM sent publicity people to Ebenezer to photograph the area and scout locations. It was a big thrill to have MGM people talking to me about Christy. Howard Horton and his wife came and spent the day. He looked at all my pictures and then went around and took shots of the Mission Foundation, the area cabins, and landscapes with his camera that gave dimensions. Every once in a while, we would hear talk about some studio wanting to make Christy into a movie, but they fell through every time. I did get several nice pictures from some of the photographers, though. They made enlargements of some of my pictures and gave them to me along with some of the ones they took of me and Barry and Benja. Catherine wrote to me and told me that a producer friend of hers named Ken Wells was interested in making the story. Catherine wanted more than anything to see Christy made into a movie, but she died in 1983 before that could happen. In 1984, there was more talk about a company buying the rights for the Christy movie, and the movie location manager came to visit me to discuss things about the story. They came back again a little later to look around more. I believe that they will make the movie this time, but I wonder if I will live to see that happen. In 1968, Sam Myers died. When Sam Myers died, Blanche, Ben's younger sister, was real nervous about making all the arrangements. She was all fidgety and wanted me to go to the funeral home with her. It was for sure a good thing that I did go. When we got down there, she didn't know the answers to most of the questions they asked her, like what were the names of your daddy's father and mother? Well, she just squirmed all around and finally said, I don't know who his father was. We just never talked about it, but his mother's name was Phroney. I thought I'd better help her out. Columbus Washington was his father, and his mother was Sophronie Burrell, but they called her Phroney. On the way home, she asked, how did you know that about my family? I just like keeping up with things like that. I've always written down what I've learned about our family's genealogy and other interesting things in my Bible or in a notebook. I found out about your grandparents when Carrie was born. See, when I told your folks that I had named him Carrie Alvin, your daddy said, how come you named him that? How'd you know that was a family name? I said, well, I didn't know it. He's named after a girlfriend of mine. Then Sam told me that your family was not really and truly Myers. His great-great-grandparents left Germany by ship to come to America with their two little twin boys, Alvin and Calvin. On the way over, there was a young man who was taken up with them. You know how you get taken up with cute little children about 18 months old. I proceeded to tell her the rest of the story. Somewhere off the coast of America, they were shipwrecked. I don't know if they were in a storm or what. Both the parents were killed, but the young man found the babies and tied them to pieces of boards and latched them together with himself. He saved them both. All that was known about the babies was that they were 18-month-old twins from Germany. The twins wore little lockets around their necks with their first names engraved on them. When they were rescued, the young man took them to a lawyer in some town on the coast of the Carolinas to find out what to do with them. It turned out that the judge in that town took up with those kids and adopted them. He was Judge Myers, and that's where the Myers came from. That's as far back as we know about the Myers side of the family. A couple of other interesting things about your family, I told Blanche, is that Ben's Uncle Charlie married my first cousin, Annie Pack, and Aunt Ollie and Aunt Della were sisters whose husbands were cousins. The church is sold. In the mid-40s, a few years after the church was moved down to the new location, we lost our preacher. The Presbyterian church said they would send preachers to fill in until they could find us one on a more regular schedule, and for some time, they did just that. We had a few members from the church in Newport that would come and try to help out, but there just weren't many who were willing to come this far and travel these roads. One time, a woman came to put on a special Christmas program, and several times they sent preachers whose entire sermon would be on tithing. The Presbyterians thought that the people up here should pay towards the preacher, but they were already given all they could. All that preaching made them feel bad, like they had done something wrong. Well, the people here for sure didn't like someone hammering them about something they weren't able to do. Of course, it's always right to preach people what the Bible says, that they should tithe and give to the Lord, but you have to know your congregation and where they are in their understanding. You teach them to give what they have. teach them that the widow just had 2 mites and she gave it all. There are a lot of people sitting in big churches in the cities who could give what would seem like a large amount of money to the people up here, but compared to what they have, that $50 or $100 bill is not much at all. Seemed to me at the time that God wanted to meet the needs of the people, but the officials were looking at the color of the ink in the bottom line to see if it was worth it. Our church people were givers. They just didn't always have money to give, but they were always real good about helping each other when there was a need. Some others in the community wouldn't help anyone who wasn't blood kin. I don't know exactly when it was that we got our next regular preacher, maybe a year or so before Papa died in 1950. Not long after Papa's funeral, the preacher and his family were in a wreck. His little boy was killed and his wife badly crippled. They decided to leave the area and go back to Georgia so her folks could help take care of her. Then after that happened, the officials just seemed to lose interest in us and never sent anyone else. I called the church in town a couple of times to ask the pastor if they had some young people who would come and read stories to the little ones on Sunday afternoon and help with the Sunday school classes. He would never talk to me, so I left messages. One of those times someone did call me back and said, "We do have a couple of people who might come if we can find a volunteer with an old Jeep or old truck to bring them. The people here just don't want to drive their new cars over those rough roads. Otherwise, if we don't find someone, we won't be sending anyone else up there to preach or help out." As you can imagine, that made me furious. A lot of the people up here had pretty good cars. They weren't new. They were A models and T models and models like that, but they were nice. Nobody needed a Jeep to get up here, especially if they were going no farther than where the church was. The people at the church never did know that the Presbyterians had pulled out and weren't helping us anymore, not until 1969. I just couldn't tell them, so I pretended all those years like the officials were still running things. I would find preachers every once in a while, usually not Presbyterians, who would come and speak, or we would just sing and I would have one of the men of the church read scripture. They would read and then the people would read. There was one young man from the Presbyterian church who came as often as he could to help out during that time. We kept on having Sunday school just like always, as if a regular preacher were there. If there wasn't anyone to teach, I would just tell someone to go read a Bible story to the children. We had vacation Bible school and Christmas and Easter programs. Of course, after the Presbyterians left, I never did pass the collection plate. I just didn't think it right for me to take the people's money. Besides, there wasn't anybody in the community working an outside job and getting paid. What was the need of embarrassing people? I paid the light bill and took care of all the bills that the Presbyterians would have paid. I saved my own tithe and bought the things we needed for the church, and if we needed something more, we would make up things and sell them. At Christmas and other special times, I would save back extra money so we could have treats and a program. Sometimes it was hard for me to keep up my tithes to the church. After paying the church bills and my bills, I wouldn't have much left, and all I could afford was a quarter a week. Every Sunday, I'd put a quarter or whatever I could in a jar. I had $22 saved up when the house burned down. I never did find it. Somebody else might have found it, but it probably just melted in the fire. In 1969, Carrie's father-in-law was coming up here and preaching for us. After one of the services, Mitchell told the preacher that he wanted to be baptized. Well, Preacher Webb didn't know what to do, so he came to me. "I'm not Presbyterian, and I don't know a thing about your rules and regulations for baptism." So I told him, "I don't know that we've ever had a baptism before, and I don't know what our regulations are either, but I'll ask the authorities and find out." Well, I didn't know who to ask. up until then, when something came up, I would always tell them, I'll ask the authorities, or I'll see what the officials have to say about that, or I'll talk to the higher-ups. And then I would go home and pray about it. That way, I never did have to lie. I just did whatever I felt the Lord wanted me to do. Sometimes, if I had trouble in the church, or if the boys would cut up, I'd say, "Don't do that, 'cause you know I'd have to report you to the authorities." That's all I'd say, and that went on for years. I didn't know what I was going to do about a baptism. I prayed about it, but I still didn't feel like I had the answer. In fact, the more I prayed, the more it seemed like I should talk to someone from the Presbyterian church to learn just what the Presbyterians did. So I got somebody to take me to see this retired pastor I knew. I told him, "I got in a jam, and I don't know if you can tell me what I need to know or not, but this boy wants to join the church and be baptized, and I don't know a thing about that." He answered, "I can tell you that, and something else about the Presbyterians that you need to know. They're planning to sell your church building. I think the people who want to buy it plan to have it moved down to the highway and use it as a bar or clubhouse or something like that. They're planning to make an offer real soon." Selling it out? Yeah, they're going to sell it out and put the money in this new church in town. They can't do that. That's just not right. We wouldn't be able to have funeral services or nothing. Weren't they even going to tell us? What can we do? I'll tell you what you can do, but you had better do it fast. My son is their lawyer. You need to go on down and meet with him. Tell him you want to buy it. His son told me that the other people had made an offer that morning for $1,000. Well, I thought for sure we could come up with $500 and they would let us have the church. The lawyer said, "No, your offer has to be more than theirs. If you can get $1,001, we'll sell the building to you." We can, and we're going to get it. So I talked to Mitchell and we worked it all out. That Friday morning, Mitchell's daddy, the preacher, and I marched into the lawyer's office and signed the papers to buy the church building. We didn't say anything to anybody about it. I didn't tell the congregation. They didn't have the first idea of what was going on. It was the funniest thing when the next week the Presbyterian preacher came down to the school to talk to me. "I want to let you know that we have sold your church." "Yes, I know all about that. We found out what you were doing. Why, we would never have even imagined it. Our church? One church selling another church to be used as a bar? Why, I never. So we just went ahead and bought the church ourselves last week." He couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Who did you buy it from?" I told him the lawyer's name, and he said, "Well, he is the lawyer for the church. If he sold it to you, then it's all yours." There were a whole bunch of Presbyterians real upset about it, too, just like taking a stick to a hornet's nest. When word got out about the officials trying to sell the Outpost Church to sinners in order to get more money to build a new church in town, that caused a split in their church, and I heard that the young man who had been such a big help to us a while back withdrew from the Presbyterian church. Someone told me that, but I don't know for sure if it's true. They said he wouldn't even go to church for a long time because he resented the way they had treated us. Kind of unbelievable, that part is, isn't it? So this part of what we read today, of course, is after last week we read about her husband Ben dying and how sad it was, and the mission burning down, all that. So today she talks in the beginning about the book, Christy. Really, Christy's the reason that we have the wonderful story of Opal. Isn't that wonderful how God works in those weird ways and ways we don't even know of? When Catherine Marshall wrote that book, she was wanting to write it because her parents had been there at the mission, and I'm sure she's very creative and was a writer, and there's all those things why she wanted to write it, but, you know, really to honor her parents. But she never knew that because she wrote it, I mean, maybe she did know later, maybe Opal told her, but when she was writing it, she never knew that a dear lady named Barbara League was going to read it and be so moved by it that she wanted to go find where that fictional place was. And she did, and she met Opal and made a lifelong friend out of Opal, and then got to tell Opal's story. It's so wonderful for Opal's family, for her daughter, her granddaughter Lori, and for all of us, though. What an amazing little sideline there. So I really love that. But interesting to hear Opal talk about how after the book was published and people there read it, and like she said, it was a national bestseller, so it was really popular. In that little area, though, there was people that really liked it, and then people that didn't like it at all. I guess maybe they felt like that somehow it was belittling to them. I understand that. I've always been sensitive to people, not fiction, not that as much, but people from outside the mountains of Appalachia trying to talk about the way, the culture, and the heritage of Appalachia, just like any group of people is like that, I would think. Like if you were, it's like if your little unit, family unit, and you know all the stories and all that, but somebody from the other side of the earth, other side of the world, decided to write a life story about your family, and they knew none of the ins and outs and none of the details. So I understand that. And maybe they'd get a lot of it right, but maybe they'd get some of it wrong. And like Opal says, Christy was supposed to be fiction, but a lot of people there probably felt like that she meant it to be true, like it was all like a nonfiction book, which of course it was not. Anyway, that part's interesting. But she says a lot of people were like her, and they really loved the book, and they had a lot of fun trying to figure out, wonder if that's so-and-so, wonder if that was my grandpa, my grandma, wonder if she was talking about, somebody I knew way back when I was a little girl. So that's really neat to think about them all feeling that kind of spotlight on them. And then you can tell that Oprah really enjoyed, of course she's already told us she enjoyed getting to talk to Catherine Marshall and tell her and her parents and tell her all about the mission from her point of view and share all those documents. Now Opal was just so enthralled with the mission that of course she wanted to talk about it. She was happy to talk about that like I'm happy to talk about Appalachia. She just loved it. So she really enjoyed talking to them. But then every time a big movie or a big deal was in the works and people would come to see her, then she got to talk to them and tell them and meet them. I'm sure it was nice to meet new people. And she got some of those wonderful photographs she said she got to keep where they would take pictures of things. They even took pictures of her and her grandkids. So that was really nice. But you can see that Opal really enjoyed having them come and talk to her about Christy if they had ever got to make the big movie. Now, I've never even watched the TV show Christy. I did like a little search and found that in 1994, I think it was, somewhere in there, that they made a made-for-TV movie, Christy. So maybe y'all may know more than that, but as far as I know, I don't think they made like a big movie, but maybe they did, and if they did, I need to make sure that I watch it, right? Really interesting when she was talking about the characters, that she thought that the one character was a mixture of two different people. Now the one, it's hard for us to believe someone get married when they're not even into their teen years. She said 11 years old. It seems so horrible to us, but that was just a different time and people grew up so fast. Now I'm not saying that I think it was right. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we have to understand it in the scope of things. That's why Opal's not shocked by it. She just says she got married really young because that was common in those days. So it wasn't like today we would be like somebody call the police, call the social services, do something, it's just wrong. But it was just a different time. But interesting when she talks about that she thinks that character is a mixture of that girl and then her grandmother Corn. You remember we read all about her wonderful stories and how much Opal loved her. I loved how she told time by the shadows. Well, you're probably, you're like me, you're not telling time, but you probably notice things. Like even right here where I'm sitting, I know by the time of day whether or not I can sit under this tree because of the shadow. Early in the morning, there's no shadow, or there is a shadow, and it's way back there in those weedy parts. It's not here. I got to wait till later in the evening for it to be like it is right now so that I can sit here and video. So there's little things like that you probably noticed too about how the shadows move around your house. But fascinating that she told time by them. That's really how she kept track of the day. Interesting when she takes, when Sam Myers dies, and she takes Blanche to the funeral home there, goes with her, and then she ends up telling her about her family. What an amazing story about the twins and them being on the boat and the boat coming apart and the man that saved them and then the judge. Isn't that just fascinating? Fascinating. Now, I'm not, and Opal says she's really into genealogy, so every time she hears something like that, she wrote it down somewhere. I hear stories about my family, and I think they're fascinating, but I don't always write them down, and then I wish I had. I wish I knew more about the history of my family. But I know from you, even a lot of you, but especially over the years, people that do genealogy have shared things with me about my family that are just fascinating. And then I had a dear friend, I have several dear friends, but Ed Ammons is one of them, and Papal here on YouTube, and then Lonnie Dockery. He's passed away, he's no longer with us. Now, Lonnie was actually fairly closely related as he began to find genealogy. As he began to research his own genealogy, the Dockerys and the Wilsons were connected, so that was interesting. But Ed Ammons has been able to share things with me over the years that I never would have known otherwise. So it's so interesting how you can find those tidbits as you start researching. If I had more time, I know that I would really, really enjoy that. But I'm glad that I've been blessed with other people that do it for me. There's another gentleman on YouTube here, Walter, and he's been sharing a lot of things with us, with me and Corey and Katie, about both the Wilsons, but the Presleys also, and it's been really, really fascinating, really fascinating. So I really appreciate all the people that have shared things about my family with me through the years. And then the ending here about the church. Isn't it amazing that Opal kept it going, which we'd already heard that in some of the previous readings, that how she'd kept the church going all those years, even though they didn't have a preacher. We did not know till now, though, that she didn't tell the congregation that the Presbyterians had really just deserted us. And that's not throwing no shade or saying nothing bad about the Presbyterians of today. This was just a unique little area, and we don't even know the people that was in charge of it or anything like that. I'm sure it wasn't a widespread thing, is what I'm saying. So please don't be offended by her saying that. But in that instance, they had just kind of forgot about their little church. And she didn't tell the congregation, I'm sure, because she didn't want to make them sad. She didn't want them all to disperse and say, well, there's no reason to go to church. They don't even care about us, so we're not going. So she just kind of kept it to herself, and it's funny, she says she'd tell them, she'd ask the higher-ups, and then she'd go home and pray. So she said she felt like she could do that without lying. And you may say, well, she's lying by admission because she just didn't tell them, didn't tell the whole truth. That's true, she didn't. But you really got to admire how she kept that church going. And then another way, example like I was talking about with Catherine Marshall and then Christy leading to Barbara League, which led us to Opal, you can see, I believe, the hand of God in another way is when it does come time for this young man to be baptized, and she doesn't know exactly how they do it. Each denomination has different ways and tenets and articles. For the Baptist, it's the articles of faith and things they follow. So she didn't know that, and she wanted to find out. Well, she kept praying and couldn't get an answer, and then finally she felt like she should talk to a Presbyterian is what she needed to do. Well, then that led her to the man that said, I'll tell you something else, they're about to sell your church. So if all that hadn't happened and she hadn't called the man, they would have just sold the church right out from under her, and she would have never had an opportunity to buy it, her and the other people there, Walter and Walter's son. Was it Walter and Walter's son, or was it Walter and Walter's father? Whichever it was, those people there that was the few that she told, they wouldn't have had the opportunity to actually buy the church. So I know that was just providence for sure, that she called the man and he was able to tell her. And then it is funny, like she says, really funny, a week later when the man comes to tell her, we're sorry, but we've sold your church. And then she gets the last laugh, though, because she says, I know you have. I can't believe you done that, but thank goodness we bought it. We bought it, and I can't believe. Why never, she says, I never would have believed you would have sold the church right out from under us. And then also, like they said, they thought it was going to be a bar. So then you think of a church, a holy place, being a bar. So she had kind of that outrage on her mind, too. Opal wins again on that one, though. Isn't that lovely? And lovely how she kept that church going. Like she said, a community, of course, the most important thing, if you're a believer like I am, is because she kept people involved in the Lord and teaching them about God's Word and and making him, hopefully they all had an intimate relationship with him. That's the most important thing. But then you think about the community aspect, a place to have their funerals, maybe a place to get married, a place to have celebrations at Christmas, at Easter, to have Vacation Bible School, and then also to come together as a church to help other people in the church or just in the community. How they would have missed. It would have been a different place if it hadn't been for that church, and the church wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been for Opal. So another amazing fact about Opal Corn Myers for sure. I hope you enjoyed this part of the reading, and I hope you'll drop back by next week so we can see what Opal talks about next.